Hey guys, tonight we begin with the remarkable life and reign of Queen Elizabeth I, the red-haired titan of Tudor England, who turned being unmarried, outnumbered, and somehow made being a virgin queen sound less like a choice and more like a threat. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Elizabeth Tudor's life didn't start with a lullaby, it started with an execution. Born in 1533 to Anne Boleyn and Henry VIII, the human equivalent of a walking midlife crisis, Elizabeth entered the world as a royal heir and was demoted faster than a disgraced court jester. Her mother, Anne, was executed on charges of adultery, incest, and witchcraft, or as historians now call it, Henry got bored. Elizabeth was 2 when her mum lost her head, literally. And as a finishing touch, Parliament officially declared Elizabeth illegitimate. That's right. Toddler Elizabeth went from princess to political inconvenience with the stroke of a quill. It's the Tudor version of getting cancelled before you've learned to read. She was swiftly removed from court, packed off to the countryside like a bad PR campaign. Her household staff was downsized, her allowance cut, and she was politely ignored by most of the court, unless they needed a reminder of how not to marry. One day she was, Your Grace. The next, just that red-haired kid with the beheaded mum. But here's where Elizabeth broke the mould. Most people in her situation would have grown up bitter, anxious, or writing moody poetry. Elizabeth? She studied. Hard. Latin, Greek, French, philosophy, theology. Basically everything except how to trust people. She became fluent in 5 languages and emotionally fluent in none. By the age of 9, she had adopted her personal motto, Video et taceo. I see and say nothing. Which, if you think about it, is a pretty bleak vibe for a 3rd grader, but it was smart. She was playing the long game, blending into the royal wallpaper while quietly clocking everyone who might someday need a poetic form of revenge. She watched the revolving door of Henry's wives and learned 2 things. 1, don't get attached, and 2, never rely on a man with a scepter and unresolved trauma. While others were trying to stay in the king's good graces, Elizabeth was busy developing a superpower, emotional detachment in a hostile political environment. She weaponized observation like most kids weaponize sarcasm. Being a royal child sounds glamorous, unless, of course, you were Elizabeth Tudor. In which case, it was less glittering destiny and more medieval Hunger Games, but with extra Latin and emotional damage. After being declared illegitimate, Elizabeth was raised with just enough dignity to avoid scandal and just enough neglect to know she wasn't really wanted. Her education was top tier. She had world-class tutors in languages, classics, and philosophy. But the real curriculum? Learning how to survive a royal family that made soap operas look restrained. Her half-siblings were walking cautionary tales. Mary, the older half-sister, had a Catholic chip on her shoulder the size of a cathedral. Edward, her younger half-brother, was Protestant, dying, and surrounded by nobles who treated the crown like a pass-the-parcel game with blood involved. Elizabeth wisely kept her opinions to herself and her daggers metaphorical. She mastered the fine art of non-committal nodding. When Protestant reformers visited, she appeared devout. When Catholic traditionalists arrived, she nodded solemnly. No matter who was in power, she was just the quietly brilliant girl in the corner, translating Cicero, and definitely not plotting anything. Probably. And then there were the stepmothers. So many stepmothers. Catherine Parr, Henry's 6th and final wife, was actually decent to her. She supported Elizabeth's education and even gave her a taste of something resembling maternal affection. Unfortunately, Catherine then married Thomas Seymour after Henry's death, and things got awkward. Seymour, who was approximately 50% ambition and 50% walking HR violation, got a little too familiar with teenage Elizabeth, waking her up early, tickling her, chasing her around the garden. Yes, that happened. And no, It wasn't normal back then either. The scandal was swiftly covered up, but the message was clear. Elizabeth was a political target, a potential pawn, and a liability with good cheekbones. She left Catherine's household with her reputation intact and a clear understanding of one thing: trust no one, especially men who smile too much. By her teens, Elizabeth had seen enough betrayal, scheming, and near execution to qualify as a Tudor war veteran. But instead of being traumatized into submission, she simply became better at hiding her reactions. Because in the Tudor world, survival wasn't about strength, it was about strategy. And Elizabeth was already winning. In 1554, Elizabeth got an unexpected invitation from her half-sister Mary, Queen of England and devout Catholic. The occasion? A charming little event called possible treason and imprisonment. Mary was dealing with a Protestant rebellion known as Wyatt's Rebellion. The rebels claimed they were fighting against Mary's upcoming marriage to Philip of Spain, not for Elizabeth, but let's just say Elizabeth's name kept accidentally popping up in conversations. You know, the usual "she probably knew something" vibes that get people locked up in castles. So, Mary had her younger sister hauled to the Tower of London, the place where royals either waited to be executed or miraculously redeemed. Elizabeth, in her early 20s, rode through the Traitor's Gate on a rainy March day, likely wondering if this was the world's worst family reunion. But here's where it gets very Elizabeth. Instead of panicking, she calmly stated that she was innocent and asked, politely but firmly, not to die. She even carved her name into a wall in the tower, because why not leave your autograph at the scene of your almost death? She also refused to be broken. When guards accidentally left her in damp rooms or tried to scare her into confessing, Elizabeth stayed composed. She didn't scream. She didn't sob. She didn't even dramatically faint, which frankly was expected behaviour for noblewomen back then. Mary, to her credit, couldn't find enough evidence to execute her, which is always a nice legal threshold. So after a couple months, Elizabeth was released. Kind of. She was transferred to house arrest in the countryside, where she was still under watch, but now with slightly better window views and fewer rats. What Elizabeth learned during this whole ordeal: trust no family member who runs a monarchy, never assume innocence will save you, and always keep a change of dry clothes nearby, just in case the tower is in your weekend plans. This experience could have broken her. It could have turned her bitter, paranoid, or fanatically devout. Instead, she became sharper, quieter, more calculating. She walked into the tower a potential victim. She walked out a future queen with a mental checklist titled, "People who tried me, we'll handle later." When Queen Mary died in 1558, most of Europe expected chaos. England had burned Protestants, flirted with Spain, and hovered dangerously close to civil war. The country was broke, anxious, and surrounded by enemies. Kind of like a Tudor group chat gone very wrong. And then, up stepped Elizabeth. She wasn't the obvious choice. Half the court remembered her as the redhead with the Tower record, and others assumed she'd be quietly removed or married off to a cousin with a country estate. But when Mary died childless, the crown didn't have many options, and Elizabeth didn't wait for an invitation. She rode into London to cheers that sounded a lot like national relief. No more burnings, no more Spanish wedding drama, and finally, someone who could read Latin and smile without causing a rebellion. Her coronation in January 1559 was, to put it mildly, a logistical nightmare. London's streets were frozen, the route was chaotic, and the nobles weren't sure whether to treat her like a queen or a very clever political boomerang. But Elizabeth didn't care. She stood in front of the nation wearing a dress of gold and white, basically screaming, "Surprise, I lived." She made it clear from day one. This wasn't going to be a reign of apologies. She wasn't going to roll over for the Catholic Church. She wasn't going to marry just to make Spain happy. And she definitely wasn't going to let her advisors run the country while she smiled and waved. Instead, she gave the kind of speech that made old bishops shift uncomfortably in their seats. She promised justice, stability, and unity, and somehow managed to say all of that without confirming her religious allegiance, her marriage plans, or her policy ideas. It was political vagueness with a crown on top. But it worked, because Elizabeth didn't need to be specific. She just needed to show that she wasn't her sister, and that she could survive and thrive in a world that had tried very hard to erase her. By the end of her coronation day, one thing was crystal clear. England hadn't just gotten a new queen. It had gotten a woman who knew exactly what power looked like, and had every intention of keeping it. The second Elizabeth became queen, the marriage offers came flooding in like pigeons to a bread fight. France, Spain, Sweden, even her own courtiers, all started suggesting eligible suitors. Tall ones, Catholic ones. Ones with questionable beards but very attractive territories. Because in the 16th century, a woman ruling alone wasn't just unusual, it was terrifying. A single queen? What if she had opinions? What if she made laws while menstruating? What if she didn't immediately hand the keys to her kingdom over to some bearded duke with a good wine cellar? But Elizabeth had a secret weapon. She had no intention of marrying. She knew the second she picked her husband, she'd become queen consort of whoever, instead of the actual monarch of England. And that just wasn't going to fly. She'd spent her entire life surviving royal instability. She wasn't about to hand power over to the first man who could sword fight and quote Virgil. So she played the long game. Publicly, she kept everyone guessing. Privately, she rejected everyone. She flirted with the idea of marriage the way some people flirt with buying a treadmill. She talked about it a lot and never followed through. And so, she crafted one of the most brilliant political identities in history, the Virgin Queen. Not because she was celibate, historians still debate that, but because it gave her the perfect excuse to stay single while projecting holiness, strength, and national unity. She married England, she said. The country was her spouse, which is a very poetic way of saying, I'm too busy for a man, and frankly, none of them are worth the paperwork. Foreign rulers kept trying. Suitors sent portraits, gifts, armies, occasionally in the wrong order. Elizabeth accepted their flattery, danced with ambassadors, and then reminded everyone that she still had no ring on her finger, and no intention of dying in childbirth like half her ancestors. By refusing to marry, she kept every court in Europe on edge. No one could predict who she'd ally with next, or if she'd ally at all. It wasn't just political independence, it was a masterclass in power hoarding, and she made it look effortless. Once Elizabeth secured the throne and politely batted away every marriage offer like flies at a summer feast, she turned her attention to managing her court, a glittering nest of vipers in lace collars. Her council was a mix of loyalists, opportunists, and deeply confused men who hadn't entirely adjusted to taking orders from someone without a beard. But Elizabeth had one distinct advantage. She'd spent her entire life watching powerful people make mistakes. Now, she made sure she didn't. Running court politics under Elizabeth was like playing chess blindfolded on a moving ship during a thunderstorm, except the Queen could see the whole board and occasionally whispered, "Checkmate," just to watch everyone sweat. Her favourite tactic, keeping everyone guessing. She granted titles slowly, rewards rarely, and trust never. If a courtier got too confident, she reminded them, gently or witheringly, that proximity to the throne was not a retirement plan. One moment you were her sweet Robin, and the next you were being sent to Ireland with a polite letter and zero military funding. Even her closest advisor, William Cecil, spent decades deciphering what she really meant when she said, perhaps. Spoiler, it meant no. But she never said it directly, because saying no closed doors. Elizabeth preferred to leave them slightly ajar, just enough to let people trip over their own ambition. She also had a flair for theatrical delay. Decisions took weeks, sometimes months. Not because she was indecisive, but because every minute of uncertainty made her court more dependent on her. Nothing happened without her signature, and her signature was in no rush. Flattery was currency at her court, but you had to be careful. One compliment too far and she'd roast you publicly. One step too close and you might be promoted or banished. No one ever knew what she was truly thinking, which is exactly how she liked it. Elizabeth didn't just sit on the throne. She performed the throne, Eyes always watching, smile always calculated, power always in reach but never fully shared. Her court didn't govern her. It revolved around her. Elizabeth I didn't just rule England. She dressed the part so aggressively that her wardrobe deserves its own diplomatic corps. The average noblewoman wore velvet and pearls to show status. Elizabeth wore velvet and pearls to declare war on your expectations. Her gowns weren't clothes. They were political armour stitched with intent and a hint of, "Try me." Every outfit she wore was a calculated power play. Massive ruffs, elaborate embroidery, and enough jewels to bankrupt a duke, all carefully arranged to scream one very specific message: "I am the state, and I am not here for your nonsense." She turned her face into a canvas of myth. White lead makeup gave her a ghostly, almost divine appearance. Her wigs, towering, curled, and occasionally weaponizable, reinforced the image of eternal youth and unwavering strength. Never mind the lead poisoning. Looking immortal was worth the migraines. Elizabeth used fashion as a psychological weapon. When she wore white, it wasn't innocence. It was invincibility. When she wore black, it wasn't mourning. It was menace. Her colours, fabrics, and jewels were selected not for beauty, but for effect. She walked into every room like she owned not just the palace, but the air inside it. And here's the fun part. No one else was allowed to copy her look. Literally. She passed sumptuary laws forbidding courtiers from wearing certain fabrics or colours. The message was clear. You may dress up, but you will never dress like me. Even portraits were tightly controlled. You couldn't just paint the Queen mid-blink or mid-frown. She had an official mask of youth, a face template painters were required to follow, so that she always looked like she hadn't aged a day since 1563. Photoshop, Elizabethan edition. But beneath the silks and sequins was cold calculation. Elizabeth understood that image is power. If she looked invincible, people would think twice before challenging her. If she looked otherworldly, people might just forget she was, technically, a mortal woman navigating a very real, very male world. Elizabeth I didn't just rule a kingdom. She micromanaged it like a CEO with trust issues and a suspicious amount of free time. While most monarchs delegated tasks like foreign policy, religious reform, and not plunging the realm into bankruptcy, Elizabeth preferred the hands-on approach. Letters passed through her hands. Speeches were edited, personally. Military campaigns, she weighed in. Portraits, approved or destroyed. Even the font size of official proclamations probably had to pass the "does this make me look weak?" test. Her council, led by William Cecil, her long-suffering chief advisor, often found themselves in a never-ending loop of submitting ideas, having them returned with 20 notes in the margins, and then being asked why it hadn't been done yesterday. Working under Elizabeth meant surviving a constant state of polite panic. She wasn't cruel, just relentless. Courtiers dreaded her glares. Ambassadors sweated through every sentence. Even Parliament treaded carefully. She once refused to give them an answer on marriage for 25 years. That's not a queen. That's a woman who turned ghosting into domestic policy. And let's talk correspondence. Elizabeth loved letters. She read them, revised them, and sometimes rewrote them entirely. If a diplomat sent something too weak, she'd tear it up. Too bold, she'd tear them up. She understood the power of words, and she made sure hers hit harder than a cavalry charge. She also ran a tight information ship. Intelligence gathering under Elizabeth was no joke. Francis Walsingham, her spy master, created a proto-MI6 that sniffed out threats, intercepted letters, and cracked codes with terrifying efficiency. If you were plotting something against her, chances are she already had your letter open, underlined in red, and ready for dramatic reading at council. All this control served a purpose. Elizabeth didn't trust her nobles, her foreign allies, or frankly, most of humanity. She'd seen what happened when power slipped, and she never planned to let go of hers. The result? A queen who didn't just sit on the throne. She ran the entire operation like a one-woman HR department, war office, branding agency, and crisis hotline. And if anyone complained, they were free to try ruling the kingdom themselves. For about 5 seconds. In 1588, Spain made a terrible mistake. They assumed England would be an easy target. To be fair, the math checked out. Spain had the largest navy in the world, more gold than sense, and a king, Philip II, who thought God was personally rooting for him. England, on the other hand, had fewer ships, less money, and a queen who still hadn't picked a husband or an heir. The whole country looked like it was held together with parchment and Protestant guilt. But Elizabeth I didn't panic. She suited up, literally. As the Spanish Armada approached, Elizabeth marched to Tilbury, where her troops were camped, and gave one of the most metal speeches in royal history. She wore a white velvet dress with a breastplate over it, because if you're going to inspire soldiers, you may as well do it while looking like a war goddess who moonlights as a wedding cake. She told her army, "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king." Translation: Yes, I'm small, unmarried and female, but I will absolutely wreck you if you touch my coast. It worked. Morale soared. The speech echoed across the camp. And while Elizabeth wasn't actually leading the ships into battle, she was bold, not insane. Her presence made it clear England had no intention of rolling over. Then, in a twist of fate and meteorology, everything fell apart for Spain. The Armada, once invincible, was pummeled by smaller, faster English ships, set ablaze by fire ships, and finally scattered by a lovely bit of Protestant-friendly weather. Some Spanish sailors ended up drowning, others limped home, cold, hungry, and very much not victorious. Elizabeth didn't let the moment go to waste. She turned the defeat of the Armada into a full-on branding campaign. Medals were struck, paintings were commissioned. God, clearly, was English now. It was more than a military victory. It was a narrative victory. Elizabeth, the unmarried queen everyone underestimated, had faced down the most powerful empire in Europe and sent it home soggy and humiliated. Never underestimate a woman in pearls and armour. If there's one thing monarchs are supposed to do, besides avoid being overthrown, it's produce an heir, preferably one who isn't a scandal in trousers. But Elizabeth I, ever the innovator, decided to skip that part entirely. From the moment she took the throne, people asked the same question. So, who's next? Her answer for 44 years was essentially, "You'll find out when I do." She never married, never had children, and most scandalously, never officially named a successor. Which, for the record, is kind of like owning a bus company and refusing to hire a driver for tomorrow. Was this irresponsible? Maybe. Strategic? Absolutely. By keeping the succession vague, Elizabeth avoided empowering potential rivals. Naming an heir in advance would have been like handing someone a crown-shaped invitation to start plotting her funeral. And after spending time in the Tower for allegedly being on the wrong side of succession drama, Elizabeth had zero interest in starring in that sequel. So, she kept everyone guessing. Would it be Mary, Queen of Scots? Spoiler, no. She got her head removed after years of plotting and letter passing. Would it be James of Scotland? Maybe, but no promises. Not yet. Foreign diplomats wrote endless reports speculating about her intentions. Her own advisers gently, and not so gently, urged her to make it clear. Elizabeth, with the grace of a cat knocking things off a table, refused. She once snapped at Parliament, saying they had no business asking about her successor unless they planned to kill her. Touché, Majesty. But behind the scenes, she likely had James of Scotland in mind. She just didn't say it out loud, because saying it made it real, and making it real meant giving someone else the spotlight. And Elizabeth wasn't about to dim hers for anyone. While Elizabeth I was busy outwitting assassins, dodging marriage proposals and refusing to name an heir, she also accidentally ushered in one of the greatest cultural booms in English history. Welcome to the Elizabethan Golden Age, also known as the time when England suddenly got really good at poetry, drama, and being extremely dramatic about everything. Let's start with the obvious. William Shakespeare. The Bard of Avon wrote most of his iconic plays under Elizabeth's reign. You know, Macbeth, Hamlet, A Midsummer Night's Dream, all those cheerful little tales about murder, ghosts, and teenage romance gone horribly wrong. Elizabeth loved the theatre and frequently patronised acting companies, even when some of her advisers grumbled that stage plays were corrupting the youth with too many double entendres and not enough scripture. But Elizabeth saw the value in art, not just as entertainment, but as soft power. Theatre was the Netflix of the 16th century. If people were watching a play, they weren't rioting. And if the play ended with a strong, clever monarch triumphing over chaos, even better. She didn't just inspire playwrights. Poets worshipped her in verse. Portraitists immortalized her as an ageless goddess. Explorers named entire colonies after her. England, under Elizabeth, suddenly believed it was the center of the universe. And Elizabeth was very much okay with that. Even science and navigation got a glow up. While she wasn't launching ships herself, she supported the men who did. People like Sir Walter Raleigh and Sir Francis Drake, who returned from voyages with maps, loot, and more than a few new enemies. These expeditions weren't always ethical or legal, but they helped fuel England's growing sense of ambition and piracy. Culturally, England went from rainy island to intellectual hotspot, and Elizabeth didn't just sit back and let it happen. She curated her image, controlled the message, and surrounded herself with people who made her reign look not only powerful, but inspired. She was a living myth, a ruler who weaponized wit and aesthetics as effectively as swords. Under her rule, England didn't just survive, it performed. Elizabeth I had no husband, no children, and no tolerance for emotional liabilities in breaches. But that didn't mean her court was free of romantic drama. Far from it. If anything, it was like watching The Bachelor, except the stakes were national stability and the lead had absolute power. Enter Robert Dudley. Dudley was tall, handsome, ambitious, and alarmingly close to the Queen, emotionally, politically, and sometimes physically, depending on who was gossiping that week. Their relationship fueled endless speculation. Were they in love? Were they lovers? Was it all one long Elizabethan flirt designed to make Europe lose its mind? Elizabeth never gave a clear answer, and that was the point. She paraded Dudley through court in fancy titles and generous land grants. She kept him near, but never too near. When rumours of an affair got out of hand, she denied everything with regal grace and just enough sass to keep everyone guessing. Even when Dudley's wife died under suspicious circumstances, possibly fallen downstairs, possibly pushed by history itself, Elizabeth did not distance herself. She just didn't marry him either. Smart move. A marriage to Dudley would have been political suicide. He was noble but not royal. Scandal clung to him like lace on a doublet, and the mere idea of the Queen choosing love over diplomacy made foreign ambassadors break out in medieval hives. But Elizabeth didn't just manage Dudley. She weaponized courtly love. She entertained suitors from France, Austria, and Sweden, smiling sweetly, accepting portraits, and then nothing. She turned negotiation into an art form, delaying decisions until the political winds changed or the suitor got bored and married someone less exhausting. By remaining single and available, Elizabeth played every side. If Spain needed placating, she flirted with a Habsburg. If France needed distracting, she promised to consider a Valois. If England needed reassurance, she reminded them that she was already married to the realm. Very poetic, very convenient. Her love life wasn't a soap opera. It was a performance, a slow, deliberate dance designed to keep enemies confused, allies hopeful, and everyone too busy speculating to notice how completely in control she was. By the late 1590s, Elizabeth I was no longer the bright-eyed redhead dazzling suitors and terrifying ambassadors. She was now in her 60s, a remarkable feat in a century when most people considered 40 to be pushing it. Her hair was wigs, her teeth were mostly theoretical, and her temper was legendary. But make no mistake, she was still the Queen and very much in charge. Old age didn't mellow Elizabeth. It sharpened her. Courtiers walked on eggshells. Ambassadors developed spontaneous nosebleeds rather than deliver bad news. She was known to throw things during council meetings, gloves, shoes, devastating insults. depending on her mood and how brave you were. Her inner circle thinned. Many of her closest allies had died or retired, and replacements never quite measured up. She grew increasingly suspicious, increasingly isolated, and increasingly fond of reminding everyone who actually ran the kingdom. She also got more theatrical. Her gowns became heavier, her makeup thicker, her persona more myth than monarch. She was no longer trying to be relatable. She was a living relic, England's Gloriana, mother of the nation, and quite possibly immortal. And yet, despite the decay and the drama, she never stopped ruling. She still read every report, signed every letter, and made every major decision, sometimes after weeks of stalling just to keep everyone sweating. Even when her health declined, she refused to lie down, quite literally. Toward the end of her life, she spent days on her feet, afraid that if she lay down, she'd never rise again. Spoiler, she was right. But here's what makes it all so impressive. Elizabeth could have coasted into her final years with comfort and flattery. She could have handed power to younger advisors, named a successor, maybe even written a memoir. Instead, she held the reins until her fingers couldn't grip them, and still refused to let go. She didn't fade quietly. She aged loudly like a royal hurricane with pearls and eyeliner. Fragile in body, maybe, but never in will. Her courtiers may have feared her, but the country? The country watched, waited, and whispered the same thing for years. She may be old, but God help us when she's gone. By the year 1603, Elizabeth I had ruled England for over 4 decades. She had outlived all her suitors, nearly all her counsellors, most of her enemies, and frankly, anyone who thought she wouldn't last. But even for a queen as relentlessly composed as Elizabeth, the curtain eventually had to fall. She just refused to sit down for it. In her final days, Elizabeth fell into a decline, physically and emotionally. Her health was failing. The court was whispering. She barely spoke, and when she did, it was often cryptic, mumbled, or laced with Tudor-grade melancholy. But the most telling moment? She wouldn't go to bed. She literally refused to lie down. For days she stood or sat in a chair, dressed, alert, and determined. Servants pleaded, physicians begged, her ladies-in-waiting wept. But Elizabeth, queen of self-control, icon of public image, believed that if she laid down, death would take her. Spoiler, it did anyway, but only after she made it wait. Eventually, her exhaustion overcame even her famously stubborn will, and she was carried to her bed at Richmond Palace. There, surrounded by flickering candles, anxious courtiers, and the dying embers of a truly ridiculous reign, Elizabeth I finally passed. No grand death speech, no royal decree carved in stone. Just the quiet end of a woman who had ruled alone, ruled fiercely, and never let anyone see her vulnerable, not even at the end. And yet, even as she faded, she managed one final political maneuver. Though she had refused for years to name a successor, when pressed one last time, she reportedly gestured toward James of Scotland. Not exactly a dramatic endorsement, but in Elizabethan politics, a subtle nod might as well have been fireworks and a press release. And so, with that quiet motion, the Tudor dynasty ended and the Stuart line began. But Elizabeth didn't go out like a fallen monarch. She went out like a statue finally stepping off its pedestal. She died as she lived, alone, unbent, and entirely on her own terms. Because for Elizabeth, surrender, even to something as inevitable as death, was never really part of the plan. Elizabeth I didn't just leave behind a throne. She left behind a blueprint for how to be unforgettable. She had no husband, no heir, no dynasty to extend her bloodline. What she had was an idea that a woman could rule not just competently, but brilliantly. That she could dominate politics, diplomacy, fashion, culture, and war, all while being underestimated by literally everyone who met her. Her reign lasted 44 years. In that time, she transformed England from a chaotic, debt-ridden, religiously divided mess into a confident, culturally explosive, internationally feared power. All this, while ducking assassinations, religious wars, and centuries of patriarchal expectations that screamed, "Please marry a man and behave." She refused, and thrived. Her legacy isn't just the Elizabethan Golden Age or the defeat of the Spanish Armada. It's the image she cultivated and controlled so precisely that it lasted for centuries. She became a living myth. Gloriana, the Virgin Queen. Astria, half goddess, half monarch, fully in charge. Even after death, she controlled the narrative. Her portraits were mass-produced, her speeches quoted like scripture, and her carefully edited persona became the national symbol of an entire era. And while later historians would try to pick her apart, her temper, her indecision, her vanity, none could deny the scope of what she accomplished alone in a world built to deny her everything. She wasn't perfect. She could be manipulative, ruthless, and emotionally distant. She clung to power long past her prime, alienated allies, and kept the country in suspense for decades. But those flaws? They were part of the machinery. The myth didn't work without the woman behind it grinding the gears. And let's not forget, she did it all without a king, without an heir, and without ever backing down. So, what is Elizabeth's true legacy? It's not just a time period named after her. It's not just Shakespeare, sea captains, or glorious portraits with enough pearls to sink a small boat. It's this. She rewrote the rules, and dared everyone else to catch up. And centuries later, we're still talking about her, still debating her, still impressed, because queens come and go. But there was only one Elizabeth I. Out of the endless wind-scoured grasslands of Mongolia, where yurts dotted the horizon and horses outnumbered people, something strange began to rise. A city. Not just any city. A capital. And not just any capital. The centre of the largest land empire in human history. You'd think Genghis Khan, founder of this empire, would have had no time for palaces. After all, his whole life was one long camping trip powered by conquest. Why settle down when your idea of fun was galloping into China, Persia, or Russia and taking whatever you wanted? But even conquerors get mail. Even world-ruling warlords need a place to store the loot. And so, somewhere between world domination and dinner, Genghis Khan picked a spot in the Orkhon Valley. It was sacred land, once home to ancient Turkic and Uyghur capitals, and it had everything a Mongol needed: open pastures, flowing rivers, and space to build something worthy of an empire. Now, let's be clear. Genghis didn't build much. He was a man of motion, not masonry. But he did mark the place. A few foundations, a temple here, a market there, enough to plant the seed. And when his son Ogedei inherited the throne, that seed exploded into something no one saw coming. Ogedei Khan, practical yet ambitious, turned that humble beginning into a full-fledged city, Karakoram. It had walls, it had roads, it even had plumbing. Mongol plumbing. And more shockingly, it had foreign artisans, captured engineers, Muslim architects, Chinese bureaucrats, and a tent palace with silver fountains that squirted fermented mare's milk at the push of a button. Civilized, right? But Karakoram wasn't about extravagance, it was a power move, a message. We may sleep in felt tents, but we rule the world. Here, emissaries from Baghdad and Paris bowed in the same palace. Here, silk met steel, camels met crusaders. And the steppe met the city. The Mongols, once thought too wild to build, were now city planners. And Karakoram wasn't just a capital, it was a contradiction in brick and bone. A place that shouldn't exist, but did. Right in the heart of the wild. If Genghis Khan was the fire that consumed the world, Ogedei Khan was the one who sat down afterward and asked, "All right, now what do we do with all this?" Inheriting a supersized empire that stretched from Korea to the Caspian Sea, Ogedei had the difficult task of civilizing the chaos. His answer? Karakoram. Ogedei didn't just want a base of operations, he wanted a stage. A world capital that would prove the Mongols weren't just horseback thugs with better aim. No, they were rulers, builders, organizers. And in classic Mongol fashion, he made it happen fast. First, the layout. Karakorum wasn't random. It was designed with military precision. Square walls, 4 gates pointing to the cardinal directions, and an inner city that housed the Khan's court. At the centre stood the Palace of Ögedei, a fusion of tent and temple, adorned with gold tiles and painted beams. It looked like a yurt had married a Chinese pagoda, and it worked. Then came the weird part. Ögedei's Karakorum became a cultural smoothie. Here was a Christian church, there a Buddhist stupa. A few steps away, a mosque rang out the call to prayer, right next to a Confucian temple where scribes copied edicts in 5 different scripts. All under one roof, or rather, one sky. Why? Because the Mongols weren't just conquerors, they were collectors. Of people, ideas and technologies. Ögedei welcomed envoys, artisans and scholars from every corner of the empire. He kidnapped the best talent and called it hiring. Persian metalworkers forged coins. Chinese engineers made siege engines. Russian craftsmen carved ivory. Karakorum was less a Mongol city and more a Eurasian laboratory. And at the heart of it all stood a silver tree. Literally. Ögedei commissioned a Franco-Parisian blacksmith to craft a mechanical silver tree with pipes running up the trunk, each one dispensing a different liquor: arag, mead, wine, and rice beer. 4 lion heads gushed the drinks. It was part faucet, part art installation, and part royal flex. To the foreign ambassadors arriving from Constantinople or Delhi, Karakorum was confusing. Was this the capital of a barbarian horde or a cosmopolitan empire? The answer was yes. Ögedei had created not just a city, but a Mongol mirror, a place that reflected everything they'd taken, twisted it into something new, and made it pour booze from a silver tree. It's easy to imagine Karakorum as a Mongol Las Vegas, full of yurts, horse dung, and wild parties under the stars. But by the mid-13th century, it had become something else entirely, a global diplomatic nerve centre. And the strangest part? It actually worked. You see, most capitals kept foreign visitors at arm's length. But the Mongols, they practically begged you to come over, for dinner, for tribute, for interrogation. Karakorum became a revolving door of emissaries, missionaries, merchants, spies, and political dreamers. It was the kind of place where a Persian envoy could chat with a Russian fur trader and a Franciscan friar while waiting for an audience with the great Khan, all over cups of fermented mare's milk. Papal legates from Rome showed up hoping to convert Mongols to Christianity. Instead, they got a tour of the silver liquor tree and a polite "no thanks." Envoys from the Abbasid Caliphate brought gifts and religious texts, only to be met by Mongols more interested in their engineering blueprints than their theology. The Mongols didn't discriminate. They just took what they liked and sent the rest home. Diplomacy in Karakorum was brisk, multilingual, and refreshingly blunt. No flowery court rituals here. No stiff robes and powdered wigs. Visitors were expected to bow low, offer gifts, and not whine too much about the smell. In return, they might get gold, horses, or a letter from the Khan promising peace, or war, depending on his mood. The Mongol postal system made this all possible. Imagine express mail powered by horses and yurts, a vast relay network of mounted couriers stretching across Asia. Messages could travel faster from Beijing to Karakorum than a medieval French king could get from Paris to Lyon. It gave the Mongol court near-instant intelligence and a steady stream of foreign visitors. And yes, Karakorum's scribes recorded everything. The city's administration was a bureaucratic Frankenstein. Scribes fluent in Uyghur, Chinese, Persian and Syriac all sat in the same room, writing the same decree in 4 different scripts. It wasn't elegant, but it worked. Karakorum wasn't just a city of tents and temples. It was a foreign ministry and a saddlebag. The Mongols didn't just conquer the world. They invited it over, handed it a cup of fermented milk, and asked what it had to offer. If you stumbled into Karakorum expecting dust and dung, you were in for a surprise, and possibly a business opportunity. Because while other cities lived off their hinterlands, Karakorum fed on the world. This wasn't just a Mongol capital. It was a trading hub stitched together by force, fear, and fermented camel milk. Under Ögedei and his successors, the Mongol Empire did something no one else had managed in centuries. They reopened the Silk Roads and made them safe. Bandits, corrupt toll collectors, rogue warlords, not under the Khan's watch. You could travel from Korea to Hungary without losing your caravan, your fingers, or your camels. Sure, you might get taxed, but you wouldn't get robbed. At least not by anyone who wasn't wearing a Mongol uniform. And Karakorum was where all that movement led. Traders arrived in waves. Persians with lapis lazuli, Chinese merchants hauling silk bolts, Russians dragging carts of furs, and Arab dealers carrying perfumes, spices, and sugar. Even European merchants, those few brave or foolish enough, found their way here, looking to score deals on exotic goods or maybe just rubberneck at the capital of the apocalypse. The market was as diverse as the empire. Silk from the south, weapons from the west, ivory carvings from India, scrolls from China, and horses, always horses, from the Mongols themselves. One Italian visitor claimed you could buy a Tibetan prayer wheel, a Baghdad saddle, and a Siberian falcon all at the same stall. But Karakorum didn't run on free market magic. It was also powered by tribute, the polite word for hand it over or we burn your village. Vassal states sent elephants, tigers, scholars, and sometimes princesses to the Khan's court. These gifts weren't just loot, they were messages. We see your authority, and we really, really want to stay alive. The tribute wasn't wasted. Karakorum became a laboratory of luxury. Foreign artisans crafted Mongol-style porcelain. Goldsmiths engraved Genghis Khan's face on everything from goblets to belt buckles. Even the city's sewer system was designed by a captured engineer from Samarkand. Efficiency through conquest. For the Mongols, trade was just conquest's quieter cousin. And Karakorum? It was the tent where both came home to roost, a city where wealth flowed in faster than you could count it, assuming you knew how to count. Imagine walking through Karakorum and hearing a church bell, a muezzin's call to prayer, the rhythmic chanting of Tibetan monks, and the crackle of a shaman's bonfire, all before breakfast. Welcome to the Mongol Empire's spiritual buffet. Most empires picked a religion and forced everyone to smile and nod, not the Mongols. Genghis Khan didn't care what gods you worshipped, as long as you didn't interfere with his taxes or military drafts. That attitude carried into Karakorum, where the only real rule was, don't be boring, and don't try to convert the Khan. Ögedei's city became a holy anomaly. A Buddhist stupa sat peacefully beside a Nestorian Christian church. A mosque echoed the verses of the Quran, while Confucian scholars debated ethics in the next courtyard. Even shamans had their place, tossing bones and reading the wind under sacred trees. This wasn't tolerance in the modern, rainbow flag-waving sense. It was pragmatic pluralism. The Mongols wanted divine insurance. More religions meant more gods on their side, or at least fewer angry ones. Why risk offending the universe by picking favorites? And religions didn't just coexist in Karakorum, they competed. Each group tried to win favor with the Khan, pitching their doctrines like used chariots. Muslim scholars presented logical proofs of God's unity. Buddhist monks offered serene detachment. Christian envoys brought wine and the promise of eternal life. The Mongols nodded politely and asked if they had any engineers. Sometimes this religious stew boiled over. A Nestorian Christian reportedly got into a public spat with a Buddhist monk about the soul's fate. The Mongols didn't punish either. They just called more witnesses. Nothing like a theology debate to spice up your lunch break. But the Khan's court had an unofficial religion. Power. The clergy of every faith wanted influence, and Karakorum was their pulpit. The Mongols, meanwhile, just wanted results. Could your god make crops grow, find water in the desert, or give victory in battle? Great. Welcome to Karakorum. The city's chaotic sacred landscape reflected the empire itself, diverse, disjointed, and completely under the thumb of Mongol pragmatism. You could burn incense or ring a bell, just don't question who's in charge. Because in Karakorum, God might be great, but the Khan was greater. For a people who glorified open skies, Karakorum's city walls might seem like a contradiction. After all, Mongols weren't known for building fortresses, they were known for flattening them. But even the most mobile empire eventually needs paperwork, and a secure place to keep it. Ögedei had the foresight to realize that ruling the world meant more than just sharp arrows. So, he gave Karakorum walls, not towering, stone-clad European monsters, but sturdy enough to keep out bandits, wild animals, and overly curious peasants. Inside those walls, something unexpected happened. The Mongols sat down and organized. The administrative machinery of the Mongol Empire roared inside Karakorum like a well-fed horse. They kept records in multiple languages, some so obscure that even the translators needed translators. Orders were issued in Uyghur script, taxes calculated in Chinese, trade agreements scribbled in Arabic, and spy reports translated from Russian. Then all copied by scribes into Mongolian archives that probably no one ever read again. Still, it worked. From Karakorum, the Mongols ran a continent-sized machine on horseback, and it ran surprisingly well, until it didn't. The secret: merit over lineage. Karakorum's bureaucracy was weirdly modern. If you were clever, loyal, and knew how to file a tax report while riding a galloping horse, you had a shot at power, no matter where you came from. Some of the empire's best governors were Persians, Chinese, or Uyghurs. Loyalty mattered more than blood. Usually. But beneath all the paperwork and silver-plated tree fountains, Karakorum had a darker side too. Conquest never came clean. Behind every foreign craftsman working on a gold inlay or designing a bathhouse was the memory of a sacked city. Karakorum was a mosaic of stolen brilliance, its beauty the direct result of someone else's ruin. And yet, the city didn't gloat. It functioned. It adapted. Its walls enclosed not just buildings, but something the Mongols never had before: infrastructure. This was the brain of the beast. The point on the map, where steps turned to strategy. Out on the frontier, Mongol generals still tore through Europe and Asia like a wildfire. But behind the walls of Karakorum, someone had to keep the empire from tripping over its own horse harness. And for a brief, dazzling moment, they did. Empires tend to fall not with a bang, but with an extended, awkward shuffle. Karakorum was no exception. From glittering capital to political afterthought, its descent was less fiery collapse and more a slow-motion sidestep into irrelevance. The trouble started the moment the Mongols stopped conquering and started inheriting. Genghis Khan's grandsons were less interested in world domination and more interested in arguing. Succession disputes tore through the empire like plague through a caravan. Suddenly, instead of one Mongol empire, there were four, each with its own Khan, its own capital, and its own reason to ignore Karakorum. By the time Mungke Khan took the throne in 1251, Karakorum still looked the part. Stone walls, silver tree, global diplomats. But the empire's centre of gravity had already begun shifting south. China was where the money was. And Mungke's brother, Kublai Khan, who had expensive taste and a soft spot for Chinese luxuries, saw little point in investing further in the wind-swept steppes. Then came the real blow. Kublai officially moved the capital to what would become Khanbalik, modern-day Beijing. He built a grand new city, complete with lakes, palaces, and all the sophistication Karakorum lacked. The message was clear: thanks for the memories, but we're moving on. Karakorum was demoted from imperial brain to dusty outpost. The scribes packed up, the diplomats rerouted, even the famous silver liquor tree likely stopped squirting. It was hard to throw a diplomatic banquet when the only guests were goats. But Karakorum didn't vanish overnight. It limped on for a time, serving as a local power centre, a shadow of its former self. There were attempts at revival. Arghun and other later Khans dreamed of returning the capital to its original glory, but the winds of history weren't listening. And then, in 1388, the final insult arrived on horseback. The Chinese Ming dynasty sent troops deep into the steppe and levelled the city. Karakorum was razed, its stones repurposed, its artifacts scattered, its name buried in centuries of silence. Today, all that remains are foundations, broken tiles, and the occasional inscription. But once, in the middle of nowhere, Karakorum had been everywhere. A city built by nomads, a contradiction that worked, until the empire that birthed it fractured beyond repair. For centuries, Karakoram disappeared like a mirage. A city that once hosted emperors and emissaries, now reduced to dust, rumour, and half-forgotten travelogues. Western scholars dismissed it as Mongol propaganda. Others doubted it ever existed in the first place. But then, the ground began to speak. It started in the late 19th century, when Russian explorers and German archaeologists went poking around the Orkhon Valley with shovels and overconfidence. What they found shocked even the skeptics. Buried city walls, Chinese roof tiles, Persian-style bricks, Buddhist artifacts, Islamic coins, Christian crosses, and yes, plumbing. Mongol plumbing. Vindication in the form of ancient drainage systems. The ruins told a clear story. This wasn't just a myth. It was a metropolis. One that housed not only tents and warriors, but glassmakers, scribes, priests, and engineers. The layout matched descriptions from medieval travellers like William of Rubruck, the Flemish friar who had visited Karakoram in 1254 and documented the city with astonishing detail, right down to the mechanical silver tree. By the 20th century, Mongolian and international archaeologists joined forces. In the 1940s, a Buddhist temple was uncovered on the city's outskirts. In the 1990s, the German-Mongolian Karakoram expedition unearthed more: artisan quarters, kilns, bronze moulds, and even inscriptions naming Ugaday. Each shovel of dirt reaffirmed that the Mongols hadn't just burned things, they built too. But perhaps the greatest rediscovery was psychological. The Mongols were finally being seen as more than horseback savages. Karakoram became Exhibit A in the trial against Western bias, a city where East met West, where nomads made bureaucracy work, and where tolerance, however utilitarian, was enshrined in brick. Modern Mongolia has since reclaimed Karakoram's legacy. Nearby Karakoram, a modest town, now hosts a museum with relics from the old capital. The area has become a pilgrimage site for historians, tourists, and proud Mongols alike. And yet Karakoram remains elusive. Most of it still lies buried, its former grandeur hidden beneath grass, stone, and centuries of silence. No standing walls, no rebuilt palace, just wind, sky, and the bones of an empire. But when you stand on that ancient ground and close your eyes, you can almost hear it. The clink of coins, the murmur of a dozen languages, and the gurgling of liquor from a silver tree long gone. Karakoram didn't endure in marble or mosaics, but its legacy did. You won't find towering minarets or glistening domes like Baghdad, or orderly Roman aqueducts, or Parisian boulevards. But what Karakoram left behind is something more elusive, proof that an empire of tents could give rise to a capital of ideas. To the Mongols, the very concept of a fixed capital was radical. They were a people born to the saddle, not the stone. Their gods rode the wind, not the chimneys. Yet Karakoram proved that mobility didn't mean primitiveness. It was the contradiction that worked, at least for a while. It showed the world a new model of imperial power, decentralized, multilingual, tolerant, when convenient, and terrifyingly efficient. Karakoram wasn't just where maps were redrawn. It was where East and West first truly collided. Sometimes literally, sometimes diplomatically. Ideas flowed in both directions, carried not by priests or philosophers, but by Mongol dispatch riders with dust in their teeth and edicts in their saddlebags. The legacy also lived on in cities that replaced it. Kublai Khan's Beijing, then Khanbalik, owed its very foundation to the administrative logic tested in Karakoram. The Yuan dynasty's capital was just Karakoram in silk robes, with better drainage. Even Timur's Samarkand and the early Russian capitals absorbed lessons from this city that once sat in the middle of nowhere, yet touched everything. And for Mongolia itself, Karakoram remains a point of national pride, not just as a memory, but as a symbol. It tells the world, and perhaps reminds Mongols themselves, that the empire wasn't all blood and hooves. It was also ink, glass, silver, and surprisingly sophisticated plumbing. Today, if you visit the Orkhon Valley, you won't see much. Rolling hills, a few scattered ruins, the sound of wind brushing against the steppe. But you'll be standing on what was once the beating heart of the largest contiguous empire in human history, a place where the sons of Genghis Khan tried to turn conquest into civilization. And even though the silver tree no longer pours mare's milk, Karakoram still whispers its defiance, that the steppe can build, that nomads can govern, and that even in the absence of stone, a capital can echo through time. Yododono's story began not in splendour, but in smoke and screams. Born in 1569 as Chacha, she entered a world shaped by shifting allegiances, clashing swords and burning castles. Her father, Azai Nagamasa, was a daimyo in the service of the mighty Oda Nobunaga, until he wasn't. When Nagamasa dared to oppose his brother-in-law Nobunaga, it didn't end in a sternly worded letter. It ended in siege, betrayal, and ritual suicide. Chacha was just a toddler when her father perished, and her clan collapsed into ash. Her mother, the famed Lady Oichi, became the spoil of politics. Taken as a concubine by Shibata Katsuie, another general in the swirling typhoon of the Sengoku period, Oichi raised Chacha and her two sisters in a household teetering on the edge of survival, but chaos followed them like a bloodhound. When Shibata rebelled against Nobunaga's successor, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, yet another castle burned. Oichi died in the flames. Chacha, again, survived. By age 10, she had already escaped 2 sieges, buried both parents, and watched the men around her stab each other for control of Japan. Trauma, certainly, but also training, because Chacha didn't break. She adapted. She was taken in by Hideyoshi himself, who saw potential beyond her noble bloodline. She was beautiful, yes, but more importantly, she was politically useful. And Chacha, still not yet Yododono, understood exactly what game she was now playing, a game of survival, subtlety, and influence. In a world ruled by men, she would learn to bend power with silence and smiles. Japan at the time was not kind to women with ambition, but it had no rulebook for women like Chacha, who could lose everything and come back stronger. Her bloodline still carried weight. Her beauty caught eyes. And Hideyoshi, rising fast toward the unification of Japan, took notice. She became his concubine, not out of love but strategy. He had no heir. She could give him one. But make no mistake, this was no passive consort. Chacha was watching, learning, and calculating. She had lived through fire and betrayal. Now, inside the golden halls of Hideyoshi's growing empire, she was ready to rise. She wouldn't be Chacha much longer. The world would soon call her Yododono. When Chacha became the concubine of Toyotomi Hideyoshi, it wasn't some romantic fairy tale. It was a political move, one of the most significant in a country still healing from centuries of civil war. Hideyoshi, a peasant-turned-general-turned-ruler, had unified most of Japan through sheer ambition and ruthless brilliance. But there was one thing missing: a legitimate heir. Enter Chacha. She was young, beautiful, and, perhaps more importantly, noble. Her Azai bloodline gave her prestige, a link to the old aristocracy that Hideyoshi, for all his titles and castles, could never claim for himself. By taking Chacha as his concubine, he wasn't just adding another woman to his household. He was cementing his connection to the ruling class he once served. In 1589, Chacha gave birth to a son, Hideyori, the long-awaited heir. With that, everything changed. Chacha was elevated in status, given the formal title Yododono, meaning Lady of Yodo. It was more than ceremonial. She now wielded influence within the court, and her son's birth positioned her as the mother of Japan's future. Other wives and concubines, especially Hideyoshi's legal wife Nene, were sidelined. Yododono had done what none of them could: secure the Toyotomi legacy. And Hideyoshi? He doted on her. He built her a lavish palace. He gave her land. He listened when she spoke. This was no ordinary consort relationship. Yododono wasn't just a womb. She was a whisperer behind the screen, a player in court politics. But behind the scenes, the cracks were already forming. Hideyoshi was aging, erratic, and increasingly obsessed with legacy. he launched 2 disastrous invasions of Korea, driven by delusions of grandeur. Yododono watched as resources were drained, and the political atmosphere grew tense. She knew what others didn't dare say out loud. Without Hideyoshi, the Toyotomi clan was vulnerable. Her son was still a child. The vassals were loyal now, but only out of fear or ambition. She had lived through regime changes before. She knew how quickly loyalty could turn into rebellion. So she prepared. Yododono wasn't just a mother now. She was a queen-maker, a protector, the iron will beneath the silken kimono. And when Hideyoshi eventually died, she didn't shrink back into the shadows. She stepped forward. When Toyotomi Hideyoshi died in 1598, his death left a vacuum no one could ignore. His son, Hideyori, was only 5 years old. The Toyotomi clan, once the unchallenged authority in Japan, was now adrift in dangerous waters. And standing at the helm was Yododono, widow, mother, regent, power broker. She wasn't officially named ruler, of course. Feudal Japan didn't hand thrones to women. But unofficially, everyone knew who held the reins at Osaka Castle. Yododono wasn't just protecting her son, she was preserving an empire. She understood what men like Tokugawa Ieyasu were already plotting, the quiet dismantling of the Toyotomi regime. Hideyoshi had tried to prevent this. Before his death, he created a council of 5 regents, trusted daimyo who were supposed to govern together until Hideyori came of age. But trusting 5 ambitious warlords to share power, that was like handing swords to 5 tigers and expecting them to take turns politely. Tokugawa Ieyasu didn't wait long. He began consolidating power almost immediately, marrying off relatives, positioning allies, and ignoring council decisions whenever it suited him. And Yododono watched. She didn't confront him, yet. Instead, she built alliances behind closed doors, kept Osaka Castle strong, and ensured that her son remained a visible symbol of continuity. The Toyotomi name still held weight, especially among those wary of Tokugawa's rising influence. While Ieyasu played politics in Edo, Yododono curated loyalty through culture. Osaka Castle became a beacon of courtly refinement. Poets, artists, and monks were welcomed. Ceremonies were grand. Gifts were exchanged. Every act reminded the lords of Japan that the Toyotomi legacy still breathed, and that Hideyori was no mere puppet. But the balance was fragile. Yododono's mere existence posed a threat. She was the mother of the only other possible unifier of Japan, and she wasn't content to play the grieving widow. She issued orders, received diplomats, and hosted lords in her own right. That kind of visibility in a woman was dangerous in samurai society. Tokugawa Ieyasu knew it. The longer she held court in Osaka, the more she became not just a symbol of resistance, but the beating heart of it. And while everyone bowed and exchanged pleasantries, the quiet tension between Edo and Osaka grew louder with each passing year. By the early 1600s, Japan was technically at peace, but beneath the polished surface, the country was a powder keg. On one side, Tokugawa Ieyasu, the aging but calculating mastermind who ruled from Edo. On the other, Yododono and her young son Hideyori, ensconced within the towering walls of Osaka Castle. At first, the tension was slow-burning. Ieyasu had been named a regent, but he had no intention of stepping aside for anyone, not even the heir of his old ally, Hideyoshi. In 1603, he made it official. He named himself shogun. The Tokugawa shogunate had begun, and with it, the slow erasure of the Toyotomi name. Yododono didn't take it lying down. Officially, she remained cordial. There were letters, visits, gifts exchanged between Osaka and Edo. But everyone knew the relationship was a performance, one polite nod away from open defiance. Yododono kept Osaka's gates closed, its armies trained, and its treasury full. The Toyotomi banner still flew, bold as ever. To Ieyasu, that banner was a challenge. Even worse, Hideyori was now a teenager, handsome, educated, and beginning to understand his status. Many samurai who felt sidelined by the new Tokugawa regime began quietly drifting toward Osaka. Yododono welcomed them. She built a shadow court, a network of lords, ronin, and monks who believed that the Tokugawa clan had overstepped, and that the true heir still lived. Then came the insult. In 1611, Ieyasu summoned Hideyori to Kyoto to pay homage. Yododono agreed, under strict conditions. The meeting was awkward. Hideyori bowed, said the right words. But Yododono made sure her son appeared not as a vassal, but as an equal. Ieyasu was not amused. From that moment on, any illusion of harmony evaporated. Ieyasu ordered the dismantling of Toyotomi defences. Yododono refused. He accused her of harbouring rebels. She sent envoys denying it, with veiled threats attached. And then, perhaps most foolishly, one of her monks built a giant bell at a temple in Kyoto. The inscription? "May the Toyotomi rule continue forever." Ieyasu saw it as a declaration of war. Maybe it was. The long-brewing conflict had finally reached its boiling point, and Yododono, no stranger to sieges and betrayals, was already preparing her next move. By 1614, diplomacy had become a distant memory. Tokugawa Ieyasu had seen enough. The Toyotomi clan, nestled in their fortified Osaka castle, wasn't fading quietly into history. Thanks to Yododono, they were making noise. Loud, defiant, symbolic noise. And for Ieyasu, who had spent years cementing his power, one loose end remained. The boy in Osaka and the woman who ruled behind him. So he marched. That winter, Tokugawa launched the first campaign, the Winter Siege of Osaka. Over 200,000 troops surrounded the castle. It wasn't just a military operation. It was a message. Submit or be crushed. Most expected Osaka to fall quickly. After all, it was one city. The Tokugawa army was the largest Japan had ever seen. But they underestimated Yododono. From within the massive stone walls of Osaka Castle, she took command. She consulted generals, reviewed reports, and made strategic decisions with the calm of someone who had spent her entire life outliving enemies. This wasn't new to her. It was the final test. And she passed it. Her son, Hideyori, now a young man, took the field in ceremonial armor, boosting morale. But everyone knew who was really steering the ship. Yododono oversaw defenses, reassured allies, and, most importantly, kept the people of Osaka united. Under her leadership, the castle held firm. The Tokugawa army launched wave after wave of assaults. They shelled the castle with imported European cannons, undermined the moats, and tried to starve the defenders out. But Osaka's walls, rebuilt thicker under Yododono's watch, held. The Toyotomi garrison fought like cornered lions. After months of frustration, Ieyasu sued for peace. Or rather, he offered a trap. The deal? He'd stop the siege if the outer defences of Osaka Castle were dismantled. Yododono, under pressure and exhausted by bloodshed, agreed. The walls were torn down, the moats were drained, and Osaka Castle was left vulnerable. It was a devastating mistake. Some say Yododono never trusted Ieyasu's offer. Others believe she was forced into it by pro-peace factions at court. Whatever the reason, the damage was done. The winter siege had ended, but the war was far from over. Yododono knew what was coming next, and this time there would be no negotiations. The peace of winter was a lie. By the spring of 1615, Tokugawa Ieyasu returned, not as a negotiator, but as an executioner. The outer moats of Osaka Castle had been filled in. The outer walls were gone, and Yododono knew she had signed her own death warrant. This was no siege of patience. This was the summer campaign, a full-blown assault meant to wipe the Toyotomi name off the map. Ieyasu brought an army once again, massive in size and merciless in intent. This time there would be no talk of surrender, only annihilation. Inside the castle, Yododono braced herself, but she was not broken. She rallied what remained of her supporters, samurai, ronin, and desperate allies who had nowhere else to go. Her son Hideyori, now 21, took on the role of commander, but as before, it was his mother who managed the castle's resolve. Every corner of Osaka was turned into a fortress. Women boiled water for defense. Artisans turned tools into weapons. The castle, despite its damage, roared back to life. It wasn't just about survival now. It was about legacy, pride, honor. The battles were brutal. The defenders fought valiantly, launching surprise attacks and night raids. For a time, it even seemed like the tide might turn, but the numbers didn't lie. The Tokugawa forces were too many, too well supplied, and too determined to let Osaka survive. On June 4th, Tokugawa troops breached the final defenses. Yododono, realizing that all was lost, prepared for the end. She and Hideyori retreated to a fireproof tower deep within the castle grounds. Some urged her to flee, to dress as a servant and slip away. But she refused. She had lived through sieges as a child, survived palace politics, ruled from behind the curtain, and defied one of the most powerful men in Japanese history. But now, with fire consuming the castle and enemy troops at the gates, there would be no retreat, no humiliation. Together with her son, she committed seppuku, ritual suicide. Mother and heir died as one. The Toyotomi line was extinguished in blood and smoke. The Tokugawa had won. But they hadn't broken her. Yododono went out on her own terms, just as she had lived. To the outside world, Yododono may have appeared only as a grieving mother or a defiant consort. But behind the stone walls of Osaka Castle, she was something far more dangerous. A strategist, a negotiator, and a quiet ruler who understood the fragile mechanics of power better than most men around her. In a society that didn't allow women to rule, she effectively did just that. She held court, received emissaries, and managed political alliances. While her son Hideyori was technically the head of the Toyotomi clan, Yododono was its backbone. She controlled the flow of information, oversaw finances, and guided Hideyori's decisions. He was the face, she was the spine. Her private chambers were not just places of rest, they were command centers. From them, she coordinated defenses, made diplomatic overtures, and balanced the delicate art of resistance. She wasn't impulsive or reckless. Every move she made was calculated, rooted in a lifetime of watching powerful men destroy themselves with ego and haste. She had learned from Hideyoshi, from Ieyasu, from the ashes of her own childhood. Her influence wasn't limited to courtly circles. Commoners in Osaka admired her resolve. Samurai respected her authority. Even her enemies admitted, sometimes grudgingly, that she was formidable. She was a woman who had suffered through war and betrayal, and turned those wounds into armor. But that armor came at a cost. Yododono's obsession with preserving the Toyotomi name became her life's purpose. Everything else, personal happiness, comfort, safety, was secondary. She became a symbol of resistance, not just to Tokugawa rule, but to the fate history had written for women like her. To fade into obscurity once their husband died. Instead, she became louder, sharper, more dangerous. Even Tokugawa Ieyasu, a man known for his icy calculation, saw her not as a widow, but as a threat. And he was right too. It wasn't just that Yododono held Osaka Castle. It's that she held it while being a woman. That terrified the old order far more than any army. Her legacy wasn't written in treaties or titles. It was carved into the memory of a nation. A reminder that power doesn't always wear armor, and that some of Japan's fiercest warriors wore silk. After the flames of Osaka died down, so did the Toyotomi name, or so the Tokugawa hoped. With Hideyori and Yododono gone, Ieyasu moved swiftly to erase their legacy. Loyal retainers were hunted, surviving family members were scattered or executed. Osaka Castle, the last symbol of Toyotomi defiance, was reconstructed in Tokugawa style, cleansed of rebellion. But try as he might, Tokugawa Ieyasu could not erase Yododono. Whispers of her legacy persisted. Stories spread through towns, through samurai households, and among women of the court. Some painted her as a tragic heroine, loyal to the end, a mother who died beside her son rather than surrender. Others viewed her as a dangerous instigator, a woman who meddled in matters better left to men. But all agreed on one thing. she had been a force to reckon with. Even centuries later, Yododono's story still divides historians. Was she reckless or courageous? Did her refusal to yield doom her son, or did it preserve his honor? Could she have negotiated more? Surrendered Osaka? Maybe. But surrender would have meant erasure, and Yododono wasn't built for fading quietly into the background. In some folktales, she becomes almost ghost-like, haunting Osaka Castle, waiting for vengeance. In kabuki plays and novels, she is portrayed as proud and beautiful, often tragic, always complex. Over time, she became more than historical figure. She became legend. And perhaps that's fitting, because Yododono lived in a world that was never built to hold her. She was born into a family destroyed by ambition. She survived 2 sieges before adolescence. She navigated palace politics, gave birth to an heir, then ruled from the shadows for over a decade, all while men underestimated her or tried to control her. She failed in the end, but she failed loudly, publicly, on her own terms, and in doing so, she ensured that no one could forget the name Toyotomi or the woman who fought to protect it. Today, her legacy survives in ruins and drama, a portrait in a museum, a statue near Osaka, a name etched into textbooks and plays. But the real Yododono? She lives in the defiance she inspired, in every woman who saw her and thought, why not me? History isn't always written by the victors. Sometimes it's whispered by the survivors. And while the Tokugawa shogunate won the war, it couldn't silence the woman who dared to defy them. Yododono's story refused to stay buried. For centuries, her legacy has walked a razor's edge between reverence and revision. Tokugawa-era chronicles often painted her as manipulative, proud, and dangerous. Everything a proper woman of the time was not supposed to be. Convenient, isn't it? After all, it was easier to blame a woman for the downfall of a clan than admit the shogunate feared her. But in modern Japan, the view has shifted. Yododono is now remembered as one of the few women in samurai history who actively shaped the political landscape, not from behind a curtain, but from the heart of the battlefield. She wasn't born into power. She wasn't married into it. She took it and held it for as long as the world allowed. And even as Osaka Castle fell, she never begged, never betrayed, never bowed. Today, she stands as a symbol of maternal strength, political acumen, and wartime courage. Museums in Osaka honor her story. Academics revisit her letters, her choices, her influence, and in every retelling, whether in textbooks, dramas, or anime, she remains captivating, complicated, and unapologetically bold. She's remembered alongside other powerful women of Japanese history, like Hojo Masako, the nun shogun, and Empress Jito. But Yododono's legacy is unique. She was not royalty, she had no legal title, and yet she held more sway than most women, or men, of her time. Her name still echoes in popular culture. She appears in stage plays, period dramas, and even strategy games. But behind the dramatization lies a simple truth. She was a mother who became a general, a widow who became a leader, and a woman who faced an empire with nothing but her will. Yododono's story is not just about resistance, it's about presence. She did not wait for power to be handed to her. She seized it. She wielded it. And when the walls closed in, she stood tall. In the end, Yododono wasn't just the last defender of Osaka Castle. She was the last flame of the Toyotomi legacy, and she burned brilliantly. In the eyes of the warlords of Sengoku Japan, Oda Nobunaga was a joke. Born in 1534 to a minor daimyo in Owari province, young Nobunaga was dismissed as erratic and uncouth. He wore eccentric clothing, mixed with peasants, and was known to dance through the streets, sword at his hip and fruit in hand. At his father's funeral, while other lords mourned in black, Nobunaga arrived in casual garb, tossed incense at the altar, and stormed off. That performance earned him a title he'd never shake, the Fool of Owari. But here's the thing, the fool was watching. Behind the strange behavior was a razor-sharp mind, one already calculating power like a chessboard. Nobunaga wasn't trying to fit in. He was making others underestimate him. While the other sons of noble houses played politics, Nobunaga was watching soldiers, studying muskets, building friendships with merchants, and challenging the old ways with every step. When his father died, the Oda clan was already a fragile house of cards, and it didn't take long for it to crumble. Nobunaga's own younger brother rebelled, hoping to exploit his reputation for chaos. Other relatives aligned with neighboring lords, assuming Nobunaga wouldn't last the year. They were all wrong. At just 18, Nobunaga launched a brutal purge. His brother was eliminated. Loyalists were promoted. Traitors were executed. The fool now commanded an army, and it moved fast. Unlike his rivals, Nobunaga didn't rely on Bushido tradition. He embraced raw efficiency. He adopted matchlock firearms, still rare in Japan, and trained his troops in modern formations. He purchased powder and steel from foreign traders, built alliances with wealthy merchants, and began turning Owari into a war machine. The old guard sneered. But Nobunaga wasn't here to be admired. He was here to win. In a feudal era obsessed with honor, ancestry, and swordplay, Nobunaga was a glitch in the system. He didn't care for poetry or pedigree. He cared for power, and how to wield it without apology. By the end of his 20s, he had secured Owari completely. No more rebellion, no more laughter. The fool of Owari was no longer playing games. He was just getting started. In 1560, Oda Nobunaga found himself facing extinction. His tiny province of Owari stood directly in the path of Imagawa Yoshimoto, one of the most powerful warlords in Japan. Imagawa had an army of 25,000 men. Nobunaga, barely 2,000. The math wasn't just bad, it was suicidal. Most daimyo would have surrendered. Some advised retreat. Nobunaga ignored them all. Instead, he threw a party. As Imagawa's army celebrated in a gorge called Okehazama, drunk on sake and the illusion of an easy win, Nobunaga armed his men with firepower, fury, and one hell of a bluff. He had his troops wave flags, beat drums, and light fires across the hills, creating the illusion of a massive force. Then, during a sudden thunderstorm, he struck. The Oda troops charged downhill with terrifying speed, using the rain to cover their movement. Imagawa's camp was caught off guard. His soldiers were lounging, unarmored, and completely unprepared. What followed wasn't a battle, it was a slaughter. Imagawa Yoshimoto himself was killed in the chaos, his severed head brought back to Nobunaga on a spear. The impossible had happened. Overnight, Nobunaga went from provincial nobody to a national player. The warlords of Japan, who had laughed at the fool of Owari, now paid attention. His victory at Okehazama wasn't just bold, it was modern. He had used misdirection, terrain, timing, and speed, not honor duels or ancient codes. It was a turning point, not just for Nobunaga, but for Japan. After the battle, Nobunaga consolidated his control over Owari and gained new allies, especially from clans that had previously aligned with Imagawa. Even Tokugawa Ieyasu, then known as Matsudaira Motoyasu, began shifting his loyalty. Nobunaga's brand of warfare wasn't pretty, but it was effective. More importantly, it proved something dangerous. Tradition could be broken. For centuries, Japan's warlords had fought by the rules. Nobunaga played with loaded dice and laughed while doing it. Okehazama made it clear. He wasn't just another daimyo looking for a promotion. He was trying to break the entire game. And from that moment on, every samurai in Japan would either follow his example or try desperately to survive it. Fresh off the blood-soaked miracle at Okehazama, Nobunaga knew momentum was everything. Victory had made him a name, but not yet a ruler. To unify Japan, he needed something bigger than swords. He needed legitimacy. Enter Ashikaga Yoshiaki, a wandering, powerless noble from a collapsed shogunate. His brother, the last Ashikaga shogun, had been assassinated, and now Yoshiaki was looking for someone to restore him to power. Every daimyo turned him away. Nobunaga said, "Sure, if I can pull the strings." In 1568, Nobunaga marched on Kyoto, the imperial capital. No one expected him to get that far. But thanks to rapid troop movement, bribed border lords, and Nobunaga's new alliance with Tokugawa Ieyasu, the gates fell with barely a fight. Nobunaga installed Yoshiaki as shogun, then kept him on a very short leash. To the public, Nobunaga was the protector of the shogunate. In practice, he ruled Kyoto like a general manager with absolute authority, but not everyone welcomed him. The capital's old money, court nobles, temple authorities, and merchant guilds were horrified by Nobunaga's bluntness. He didn't bow, he didn't flatter, he didn't pretend the past mattered. He tore down old barriers between classes, imposed brutal taxes, and stationed soldiers wherever he pleased. The samurai elite had never seen anything like it. The tension worsened when Yoshiaki realized he was a puppet. He began plotting behind Nobunaga's back, secretly rallying opposition among Buddhist monks and rival warlords like the Takeda, Uesugi, and Mori clans. Nobunaga responded with swift violence and cutting sarcasm. He had no patience for decorative rulers. But betrayal was the cost of change. Nobunaga embraced it. Rather than trying to win everyone over, he built a coalition of merit over birth. Men like Toyotomi Hideyoshi, a peasant-turned-genius administrator, and Akechi Mitsuhide, a refined court samurai with a calculating mind. They weren't just warriors, they were thinkers. Nobunaga's inner circle wasn't noble, it was effective. As enemies circled, Nobunaga kept pushing forward. He built roads, regulated markets, banned private tolls, and made it clear he wasn't restoring Japan, he was reinventing it. And if the shogun or the temples or the aristocracy didn't like it, too bad. They'd had their turn. If there was one institution that dared to stand against Oda Nobunaga, it wasn't a rival clan. It was the Buddhist temples. Specifically, the Iko-Iki, warrior monks and armed peasants, who followed a radical branch of Pure Land Buddhism. They didn't just pray, they fought. They held land, collected taxes, and even formed their own armies. Their strongholds weren't just temples, they were fortresses. The biggest of them all? Enryakuji, perched atop Mount Hiei, overlooking Kyoto. To Nobunaga, these monks weren't spiritual. They were political, and worse, disloyal. Many of them had backed his enemies. They issued edicts, incited rebellions, and refused to bow to his authority. So in 1571, he made a decision that would stain his legacy forever. He marched 30,000 troops to Mount Hiei. The monks expected a siege. What they got was an extermination. Nobunaga ordered the complete destruction of Enryakuji, and he meant complete. His men torched the temples, slaughtered resisting monks, and killed anyone who got in the way. Women, children, elderly, pilgrims. The mountain burned for days. Some accounts say over 20,000 people died. It wasn't just cruelty. It was a message. No one, Nobunaga declared, shall ever again use religion to threaten the state. The shockwaves were immediate. The elite were horrified. Even his own generals flinched. But the effect was undeniable. Other temples quickly backed down. The Iko-Iki panicked, abandoning outposts. Nobunaga, once seen as an upstart, was now feared as something far more dangerous. A reformer who didn't care about sacred cows. And this wasn't a one-off. In the years that followed, he laid siege to other temples, including the massive Ishiyama Hongan-ji fortress in Osaka. 10 years of bloodshed followed. 10 years. Nobunaga even used naval blockades, unheard of for inland warlords. He would not tolerate pockets of religious resistance. Some saw him as a demon, others as a necessary evil. But to Nobunaga, he was simply clearing the rot. Tradition had kept Japan fragmented. Religion had sheltered warlords and rebellions. To unify the country, he had to burn the old world down, literally. And so the fires of Mount Hiei didn't just destroy temples, they lit the way for a new Japan. One built not on prayer, but on powder, steel, and order. One of Nobunaga's most revolutionary moves was his embrace of firearms, a weapon almost every traditional samurai despised. When Portuguese traders arrived in Japan in 1543, they brought with them the matchlock arquebus, a crude but deadly gun. Most daimyo dismissed it as a novelty, too slow and unreliable to replace the sword. Nobunaga saw potential. He purchased guns in bulk, imported gunpowder, and trained his soldiers in new tactics. Nobunaga's men formed organized volley fire units, coordinated to create near-constant gunfire, an innovation unheard of in Japan. At the Battle of Nagashino in 1575, Nobunaga's use of tens of thousands of arquebusiers behind wooden stockades decimated the famed cavalry charges of the Takeda clan, changing the face of samurai warfare forever. This wasn't just tactical genius, it was cultural revolution. The samurai code prized swordsmanship, face-to-face combat, and honor in battle. Guns reduced all that to efficiency and sheer destructive power. Nobunaga shattered centuries of tradition, showing that technology and strategy trumped ritual. His opponents struggled to adapt. Many were reluctant to train peasants as soldiers armed with firearms. Nobunaga wasn't. His armies included commoners, merchants, and ronin, all trained to fight with guns and discipline. This changed the social fabric of Japan. Nobunaga wasn't just unifying provinces, he was breaking down the old class hierarchies. A foot soldier with a matchlock could kill a samurai on horseback. Nobunaga's gun tactics became a model for the future. Daimyo across Japan scrambled to acquire firearms and reorganize their armies. The gun was no longer foreign, it was Japanese. The success of Nobunaga's modern warfare extended beyond battles. It created a centralized, disciplined military that could enforce order and push back the power of religious enclaves and rival lords. It laid the foundation for the unification of Japan. In embracing the firearm, Nobunaga rewrote the rules of engagement and the rules of society. He wasn't just a warlord, he was a revolutionary. By the late 1570s, Nobunaga had transformed from a regional troublemaker into the most powerful daimyo in central Japan. But he wasn't done yet. The country remained fractured, ruled by a patchwork of rival clans, autonomous temples, and petty warlords who refused to bow. Nobunaga's goal was clear: unify Japan under his rule. But that meant more than winning battles. It meant breaking centuries-old social orders, political traditions, and cultural norms. One of his key strategies was a ruthless campaign against rival clans who opposed his dominance. The Takeda clan, famed for their cavalry, were among the most feared. Nobunaga's victory at the Battle of Nagashino broke their power, signaling a shift from mounted warfare to gunpowder dominance. At the same time, Nobunaga secured alliances with key families like the Tokugawa, led by Ieyasu, who was building his own base in eastern Japan. These alliances weren't built on trust but mutual benefit and fear. Nobunaga was as savvy in diplomacy as he was on the battlefield. But Nobunaga's reforms extended beyond war. He restructured the economy, promoting free markets and road building, easing trade between provinces. He abolished tolls on highways, allowing goods and armies to move faster. This not only increased his tax revenues, but also weakened his rivals who relied on tolls for income. Religious institutions that threatened his authority were dealt with harshly, as we saw with the burning of Mount Hiei and the protracted siege of Ishiyama Honganji. Nobunaga refused to allow any power to rival his own, even if cloaked in prayer. In the imperial capital Kyoto, Nobunaga exerted influence over the emperor and court nobles, using them to legitimize his rule while keeping real power firmly in his hands. By the time Nobunaga controlled vast swaths of Japan's heartland, the unification process was irreversible. Yet, despite his power and reforms, Nobunaga was not universally loved. His methods were brutal, his disdain for tradition shocking. Nobles whispered that he was a demon, while commoners feared the fires of his campaigns. Still, his vision of a unified Japan was clear and inexorable. The stage was set for the next chapter in Japanese history. One Nobunaga's successors would continue, but none could begin without him. Despite his overwhelming power and sweeping reforms, Oda Nobunaga's rise was cut short by betrayal, a dramatic twist fitting for a man who rewrote Japan's rules. In 1582, Nobunaga was resting at Honnoji Temple in Kyoto, vulnerable and isolated. His general and longtime ally, Akechi Mitsuhide, turned against him in a shocking coup. Akechi's forces surrounded the temple, cutting off Nobunaga's escape routes. Outnumbered and trapped, Nobunaga chose to take his own life rather than be captured. The reasons for Mitsuhide's betrayal remain murky. Some say it was personal, resentment over mistreatment. Others suggest political calculations or pressure from rival clans. What is clear is that Mitsuhide underestimated Nobunaga's legacy. His rebellion lasted only 13 days before he was defeated by Toyotomi Hideyoshi, Nobunaga's loyal general who quickly avenged his lord's death and took up the banner of unification. Nobunaga's death sent shockwaves through Japan. The man who had upended centuries of tradition and crushed countless enemies was gone in a single day. But his vision lived on. His army remained powerful, his reforms were irreversible, and his successors would complete what he started. The fall of Nobunaga was not the end. It was a passing of the torch. Hideyoshi would soon rise, building on Nobunaga's foundation to unify Japan further. But Nobunaga's death was a brutal reminder. In a world ruled by swords and ambition, even the most brilliant can fall. Oda Nobunaga's story is not just one of conquest, it's a story of transformation. He revolutionized warfare, shattered social norms, and redefined leadership in Japan. His bold adoption of firearms changed the samurai code forever. No longer was victory guaranteed by skill with the sword alone. Nobunaga's armies demonstrated that technology and strategy could topple centuries of tradition. The volley fire tactics he pioneered forced every daimyo to rethink how war was fought. But his innovations didn't stop at the battlefield. Nobunaga's economic reforms helped lay the groundwork for a modern Japan. He dismantled toll barriers that had long stifled trade, promoted free markets, and encouraged the growth of cities like Azuchi, where his famous castle stood, a symbol of power and modernity. Politically, Nobunaga centralized power in ways that hadn't been seen since the Ashikaga shogunate. He wielded the emperor as a political tool, but held the real power behind the throne. His disdain for old hierarchies opened doors for talented individuals regardless of birth, changing the social fabric. Nobunaga's ruthless suppression of religious institutions showed his focus on secular authority and the unification of the state, even if it earned him enemies who branded him a demon. Though his life was cut short, Nobunaga set Japan on a path toward unity and modernization. His successors, Toyotomi Hideyoshi and Tokugawa Ieyasu, would finish the job, but none would have succeeded without the groundwork he laid. Today, Nobunaga is remembered as a visionary, a man who saw beyond the customs of his time and dared to forge a new future with fire and steel. Though Oda Nobunaga's life ended abruptly at Honnoji, his impact on Japan's history echoes through the centuries. He was a man who refused to be bound by tradition, a visionary who saw that the future demanded change, even if it meant burning down the old to build something new. Nobunaga's innovations in warfare permanently altered the samurai's way of life. His embrace of firearms and massed volley tactics made cavalry charges and sword duels obsolete. This shift democratized power on the battlefield, allowing common soldiers with guns to challenge noble samurai with swords. Politically, Nobunaga shattered the feudal stagnation that had held Japan in constant warfare for over a century. By centralizing authority and breaking the power of rebellious religious institutions, he paved the way for the eventual unification of Japan under a strong central government. His economic reforms encouraged urban growth and free trade, helping Japan transition from a fragmented feudal economy into a more connected and prosperous society. His castle at Azuchi wasn't just a fortress. It was a cultural symbol of the new era, blending military might with architectural innovation. Even culturally, Nobunaga's legacy lives on. He was a patron of the arts and tea ceremony, signaling the dawn of the Azuchi Momoyama period, a time of flourishing culture and aesthetic refinement. While Nobunaga himself never achieved full unification, his successors, Toyotomi Hideyoshi and Tokugawa Ieyasu, built upon his foundations. Without Nobunaga's ruthless drive and radical reforms, the peace and stability of the Edo period might never have come to be. In Japanese popular culture, Nobunaga remains a complex figure, a brutal warlord, a reformer, a visionary, and a man who dared to dream of a united Japan. His story is told in countless books, films, dramas, and video games, continuing to captivate and inspire. Ultimately, Oda Nobunaga's rise was more than a tale of power. It was the beginning of modern Japan's transformation, a testament to the force of innovation and ambition. And though his life was cut short, his fire still burns bright in the story of Japan's past and future.